Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Panem Reborn. I hope you guys have had a good week or weekend or wherever it is for you, and I hope you've been enjoying the series. So I did just want to let you guys know that as of the 111th games, I'm going to be taking a step back from Panem Reborn. I'm going to be going on hiatus for at least a few months. Just to sort out some mental health things and just for my own health. So just letting you know that ahead of time. But I'd like to thank the usual people in order to make this series possible. So thank you to Christian Blanco, whose series Tales of the Hunger Games this series is based off of, and his link to his channel can be found in the description below. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean, whose art is used in this series. Thank you so much, Andrew, and his blog is also linked below. Lastly, I'd like to thank my editors, Anna, Octavian Seja, and Raby, who helped edit some of the early episodes of this series. So thank you so much for doing that, and I think that's the only announcements I have for today, so let's dive into Panem for today. This year's reaping in District 10 occurred amid an entertaining display from Heifer Muller, victor of the 105th Hunger Games, who arrived to the reaping in his golf cart while intoxicated and nearly bowled over a group of small children in the rear of the crowd. Once this awkward situation had been sorted out and the traumatized children safely returned to their families by peacekeepers, the reaping commenced. After a brief speech by the district mayor, Oakley Barbosa, last year's victor of the 108th Hunger Games, stepped up to the stage to draw a name from the female reaping bowl while casually smoothing back his messy hair. Plucking a name from the bowl and reading it to be that of 14-year-old laurier-rose, Oakley was cut off by a scream from the crowd as a petite girl with auburn hair and a sprinkling of freckles was shown to have frozen in place, paralyzed with fear. Laurier had to be scooped up under the elbows by a pair of peacekeepers and dragged to the front as she tried to hide her quivering lip and the tears running down her cheeks. Rosalia Sanchez commented that the girl did not seem to have the District 10 look, or even a District 10 name, to which Cornelia Breen replied that it was possible Laurier could be related to one of a limited number of French transplants permitted in continental Panem for cultural cooperation since the annexing. Laurier continued to whisper at the front as Oakley crossed to the other side of the stage to draw the name of the male tribute, completely ignoring the trembling girl standing near him. He selected and read aloud the name of 15-year-old Carrie Santiago, a tanned boy with curly black hair and dark eyes who glanced around nervously upon being reaped. It was clear to many Capitol viewers that he had been outdoors earlier that morning and was unprepared to be reaped, as a few straws of hay were scattered about in his hair and on his battered tan overalls. Carrie reluctantly joined Laurier up on the stage and offered her an awkward-looking side hug, clearly trying to be comforting but unsure how. The pair were presented to the district as their tributes for this year, raising their hands together in shaky unity. Peacekeepers permitted them to see their families, with Laurier sobbing into her parents' shoulders and speaking with them in soft French. Carrie embraced a pack of several younger siblings and a distressed mother, emptying his overall pockets and pressing small coins, his savings from fieldwork, into each of their hands. The tributes were then escorted out to the district's train station after saying their goodbyes, mentally preparing themselves for their journey to the capital. Upon their arrival at the train, the pair had hardly entered the first car when they noticed the elaborate lunch spread placed out for them, along with 3 chairs positioned at the table. 2 of these chairs were facing each other, while the last was at the head of the table. Carrie nudged Laurier and speculated that this chair was for their mentor, while they both quickly helped themselves to large portions of crown roast, an array of colorful vegetables in all shades of the rainbow, and miniature fruit jellies that Laurier quietly commented in her soft accent reminded her of tiny jewels. Across from her, Carrie loudly slurped from a soup bowl filled with a pale pink broth and several herbs, causing Laurier to timidly giggle when he looked up from his soup and had an herb mustache. The pair were soon joined by their mentor, Heifer Muller, victor of the 105th Hunger Games, who arrived in the carriage swigging from a bottle of whiskey and humming a merry tune while wearing nothing but an orange silk robe and fuzzy slippers. He immediately noticed his shocked tributes and almost dropped his drink, clearly having forgotten he was not the only one on the train. Heifer hastily made up for this lapse in judgment by grinning brightly and tossing the whiskey glass out the window, where it shattered the window pane and a cat yowled in the distance at being hit by the flying projectile. Heifer joined them at the dining area and proved Carrie's prediction correct as he plopped down in the seat at the head of the table. Chowing down on a flank steak and devouring it within half a minute, the juice running down his chin, Heifer asked his tributes through a mouthful of food if they had any special skills, to which Carrie admitted that he believed he could lift and throw heavy weights, considering his daily job was working as a ranch hand. Heifer nodded approvingly and gulped down his steak while taking a sip of water from his water glass. Lourdes shyly responded that she did not believe she had many skills relevant to her district, as she was a milkmaid back in her home district and still in school in District 10, but that she could likely work well with District 15 due to her knowledge of French. Immediately, Heifer spat out his water and turned to Lourdes, booming that if her only skill was allying with people who could kill her at the drop of a hat, he did not want to waste his time mentoring her. Lourdes' eyes began to well up with tears, and he softened a bit as even he realized how harsh his words had sounded. Carrie watched uneasily from across the table, pushing around some broccoli on his plate. Heifer continued talking but did not apologize, telling Lourdes that she would need to toughen up if she wanted to be taken seriously by potential sponsors. He reminded his tributes that while he had many capital connections, they could only go so far, and the tributes would need to prove themselves worthy of winning through their conduct. The tributes at first appeared apprehensive to take Heifer's advice, but he continued to speak at length and offer helpful information on what he had gleaned so far about the capital's likes and dislikes when it came to tributes' personalities and presentation. After all three had finished their meals, Heifer shooed them over to the sitting area and turned on the television to allow them to watch the other Reapings and their live coverage. When District 5 was shown on screen, including Austin Clark, victor of the 103rd Hunger Games, Heifer scowled and jabbed a finger at Austin before declaring that he did not want his mentees allying with the mentees of the Evil One. This prompted Carrie to ask what Heifer had against Austin, to which he waved a dismissive hand and muttered something about having a punchable face, though the camera zoomed out at this time to show his cardboard Janvier cutout barely visible in the next train carriage over. The Reaping coverage continued for some time, pausing only for a brief commercial break. When the tributes from 10 tuned back in, Oakley Barbosa was stepping up to the front podiums in District 1 to reap the female tribute for the 109th Hunger Games. Heifer encouraged his tributes to watch closely as he warned them that with each passing year of the Games, District 1 was growing to be more of a threat in the arena, although he admitted that with a drunk for a mentor and the constant infighting that had plagued the career pack of the past 3 years, he had yet to take the district completely seriously. Unlike earlier in the day, when Oakley had been drawing names with a casual flair, he now appeared quite unsettled to be performing the reapings in the final district on his tour. This was reportedly due to his nervousness at having reaped his own brother, Forrest, back in District 7 in the early afternoon, and he had clearly been stressed ever since this time. The cameras honed in on the podium as Oakley drew the name of 14-year-old Cornelia Creed. Many in the district gasped, as it was unusual for younger tributes to be selected for the Games, although Capitol commentators remarked that it was likely this was due to the district's past history of great quantities of volunteers. Since the Civil War, District 2 had continued to cement its place as the Capitol's lapdog. On the other hand, District 1 failed to hold its interest as much due to its embarrassing first victor, Alexander Nicoline, and the fact that it had not taken the same initiative as District 2 in restoring the capital to power after the wars. A smallish girl with sleek red waves of hair and luminous greenish-blue eyes strode forward to the front stage, her facial expression calm and neutral and her slightly tattered scarlet dress nearly catching on the pavement as she moved forward. She showed no fear nor any sign of enthusiasm at being reaped. Camillo Anderson raised his eyebrows from inside the commentary room and commented that she looked like she was sitting through a boring class lesson rather than being reaped for the Hunger Games, a description echoed by his co-hosts, Rosalia and Cordelia. Oakley, as was customary by now, ignored her and stepped over to the male reaping bowl, appearing to wring out his slightly shaking hands while performing his duty. The next name he reaped was that of 18-year-old Agate Jones, a tall and slender boy with chestnut hair and brilliant blue eyes, who waved around at the cheering crowd, excited that a strong and good-looking tribute had been selected. He winked at the peacekeepers coming to collect him, asking if they were there to collect him or perform a pat-down search, and inviting them to get up close and personal. The peacekeepers were unamused by this stunt and manhandled him to the front, dropping him off next to Cornelia. Agate slicked back his hair with a hand and offered Cornelia a handshake, but she smiled sweetly and reached over, closing his hand into a fist for him and leaving him slightly embarrassed. Agate and Cornelia were presented as the official District 1 tributes for the 109th Games amid cheers and whoops from the crowd. They were then permitted to see their families before departing for the capital. Agate was clapped on the back by a group of identically well-built brothers and parents, while Cornelia hugged some surprisingly ragged-looking younger siblings and a worn-down mother. The pair were escorted by peacekeepers to the train after this, waved off by their cheering fellow citizens at the train station. The pair from 1 entered the train and made themselves comfortable. while Agate showed absolutely no interest in the lavish spread of capital food laid out across the table, and instead headed right to the television to watch the post-reaping commentary. Cornelia stared at the painted porcelain dishes in sheer awe, and quietly piled up a plate with one of almost everything. The tributes both ignored each other after the incident at the reaping, hardly even looking each other's way until their mentor arrived, or rather staggered into, the train carriage. Alexander Nicolline, victor of the 104th Hunger Games, entered the carriage with a mostly empty beer bottle, trying to swig the last dregs at the bottom. He slowly raised his bloodshot eyes to the tributes, lanky dark hair flopping around his watery eyes and forehead like the ears of a lost puppy. Agate and Cornelia stared back at him warily, wondering what he could potentially do next and assuming somewhat defensive postures. Alexander set down the beer bottle on the table and watched them carefully, appearing surprisingly alert despite his apparently inebriated state. He invited them to both sit down at the dining table, where Agate gallantly pulled out a chair for Cornelia while grinning, only to be greeted with a suspicious scowl from his district partner. Alexander studied the pair from the end of the table and began to speak in a low, rumbling voice reminiscent of a beast waking from its slumber, and quite different from his normal voice. He quietly informed the tributes that if they wished to succeed in the arena, they would need to trust each other, though as he said this, Agate stuck his tongue out at Cornelia, and she made a sour face in response as the pair began to argue about this. Alexander sighed and waggled his fingers in the direction of the pair, grumbling that it was this kind of attitude that would ensure they both died in the bloodbath, which silenced both of the squabbling pair at once. He then scanned them over while summoning a nearby Avox to prepare him a drink, taking in their appearances and demeanors. As Alexander was handed a freshly made highball in a tall frosted glass, he picked it up and pointed his pinky at Agate from around the side of the glass. Alexander asked Agate if he would consider himself wealthy, being from one of the wealthiest districts in Panem, to which Agate grinned cheekily and remarked that his father was one of the most well-known and reputed winemakers in the district. Alexander raised an eyebrow and calmly remarked that you should have no problem getting sponsors in the arena then, before waving a hand and dismissing Agate from the table. The boys stared back in disbelief at being waved off from the table without having a chance to eat anything, but Alexander serenely reminded him that he would be able to order room service at any time from his own carriage, should he feel the need to do so. As soon as Agate had stormed out of the room in a huff, Alexander turned to Cornelia and offered a warm smile. He told her that he had noticed her tattered red dress and the soot on her siblings' noses when they had been saying their goodbyes, asking Cornelia about her place of employment. She stared in shame at the clean white tablecloth and replied that she was employed as a laborer at the Brown Ruby mine, though Alexander quickly interjected before she could say more and reminded her that it was nothing to be ashamed of. She slowly looked up at him with a small smile, and they continued to quietly talk about the games for the rest of the trip, while Agate ordered every single item from the room service menu in his carriage. The District 10 tributes arrived at Mace Station amid a curious crowd, interested to see their much-loved heifer Muller, but not particularly impressed by the uninteresting reapings of the district's tributes for this year. Heifer eyed the crowd as the three of them stepped out from the train, hands clamped on the shoulders of both his tributes. He allowed them to disperse through the crowd, as Lord Day allowed some young girls to braid strands of her hair, and Carrie was fawned over by some motherly capitalites. Heifer ignored the herd of people jostling to talk to him, and instead focused on watching his tributes closely, nodding and guiding them along once they asked to leave the crowd and be taken to their accommodation quarters. However, the District 1 tributes stood as far apart as possible when exiting the train, clearly too irritated with each other to present a unified front. Alexander grimaced as he steered them out of the train, muttering something about even last year's tributes being more bearable than the awkwardness between Agate and Cornelia. Despite the tension between them, the pair still knew how to greet their fans, as Agate was swarmed by a crowd of simpering capitalites, and Cornelia stuck to Alexander's side while he greeted a few acquaintances. Alexander herded them away to their apartment after a few minutes of meeting and greeting, eyeing Agate warily and gently escorting Cornelia as if she was a younger sister rather than a tribute. Meanwhile, Carrie and Lord Day were steered by Heifer into their apartment, where their stylist, Dolabella Harcourt, awaited them with a large portfolio of potential designs. Heifer pursed his lips as she flipped through the booklet, clearly remembering his own disaster of a parade costume during his own games. At last, after several minutes of unappealing designs, Heifer sighed and stopped Dolabella at a matching set of leather pantsuits covered in fringe with tiny fake cacao beans at the tips. Her eyes lit up in manic delight, and she tossed the costumes to Carrie and Lord Day to wear, amid Lord Day's disgust and Carrie's apprehension. After the tributes had been dressed and makeup applied, Heifer and his tributes winced while Dolabella beamed at them. Reluctantly, Heifer sent his tributes down to await the start of the tribute parade. Agate and Cornelia arrived with Alexander at their apartment to greet their stylist, Dardanius Nym. He beamed upon seeing them and clapped his hands, clearly quite excited to be working with such a striking pair. Alexander nodded politely to his former stylist, but seemed slightly uncomfortable after having been pushed around and closed in by the crowd at the train station, excusing himself to the balcony to take a breather. Dardanius showed them a flipbook of outfits, delighting both tributes with their glamour and majesty. The costume choices even managed to put a temporary end to the passive aggression between Agate and Cornelia, who settled together on a white dress and suit swirled with streaks of gleaming emeralds. The tribute parade went off without a hitch this year, in a manner that Rosalia Sanchez described as unusually smooth. Agate and Cornelia flashed practiced smiles and waved to the adoring crowd, accepting bundles of flowers and even a pair of lacy underwear thrown at Agate, though it was noted by a sharp-eyed Cordelia Breen that, again, they never once attempted to show unity by holding hands or interacting with each other. Lourdes seemed slightly intimidated by the large amount of people in the area, and her eyes widened upon hearing their names being chanted, but Carrie reassured her by kindly clasping her hand in his and raising their hands up to cheers from the gathered crowd. Camillo admitted that while he generally disliked the pair's overly fringy costumes, at least they had spirit. Rosalia added that she was impressed by Carrie's poise, stating that she had not had high expectations of him from the start with his messy appearance at the reaping, but that the tributes from 10 had slightly grown on her. Agate and Cornelia were almost drowned in floral bouquets by the time the parade concluded and President Mace made his yearly speech, while Carrie was still trying to console a shaken Lourdes. After reviewing all of the costumes, Camillo Anderson announced on air that he would be awarding Anderson Fashion Best Dress for the 109th Games to District 5, citing their sleek solar panel-inspired ensembles as shining like the sun itself, though he did admit that most of the costumes this year were not half bad. As soon as the parade was concluded, the tributes were all sent back to their apartments to rest and get ready for the following days of training. Carrie had a gentle arm draped around Lourdes as they re-entered their apartment, only to find an irate Heifer ready to scold them about Lourdes' shyness at the parade, as it appeared he was quite frustrated that he had lost some potential sponsors for them once the sponsors had seen Lourdes looking terrified in her chariot. Though Heifer appeared irritated that he had just lost some chances to keep his mentees alive in the games, Carrie tactfully reminded him that it had been a long day, and that it would probably be best for all of them to get some rest rather than arguing about something that had already happened. Heifer swigged some scotch and scoffed, but upon realizing Carrie's point, reluctantly agreed. Alexander congratulated his tributes on a job well done at the tribute parade, though both his mentees observed that he appeared to be quite tired and more than a little inebriated once again. He shooed them off to bed, stating that they needed to get some rest for the next day. Agate loudly yawned and headed to the bathroom to wash up, but Cornelia stayed out in the living room and focused her gaze on Alexander. She calmly walked over to him and swiped the liquor bottle from his loosely dangling hand, tossing it in a nearby garbage can and crossing her arms. Alexander half-heartedly raised his other arm in protest, but Cornelia shook her head and firmly told him that he could not continue drinking while mentoring them, as it was affecting their confidence and making them look weak as a group. He sighed and agreed, sending Cornelia to bed before quietly dumping the rest of the liquor bottles from the dining table off the balcony. The tributes were awakened bright and early the next morning to commence their 3 days of training, which promptly began with Gloria Steele striding in and slipping on a banana peel left over from a careless trainer's breakfast. She growled in fury and looked around, quickly picking herself up and dusting herself off. The trainers, who up until this point had been standing dutifully at their stations, magically seemed to retreat into the shadows a little at seeing their boss about to throw a fit. Gloria's eyebrow twitched, but upon remembering that she was in a room full of tributes awaiting instructions, she composed herself and put off punishing the trainer responsible for the stray peel until later. Once she ran through the instructions as usual, Gloria hobbled off and allowed the tributes to disperse with a dismissive wave of her hand. Agate quickly found himself buddying up with Pompeo and Megan, the pair from 2, as an irritated Cornelia looked on and grumpily followed them around to the various weaponry stations. Lourdes glued herself to Carrie's side and refused to leave him at any station, her eyes darting around rapidly whenever other tributes approached. The pair made their way around various survival stations, though they were briefly split up when Carrie went to try his hand at the weightlifting station, and Lourdes decided to make quiet conversation with Valletta from 6 at the edible plant station. The careers training process was a rather different story, as Agate and Pompeo bonded by fighting each other at the hand-to-hand combat station, while Cornelia and Megan watched. However, while Megan seemed enthralled by the fighting and encouraged the boys to knock each other's teeth out, Cornelia wrinkled her nose. The 3 days of training this year saw a multitude of low-grade injuries and scrapes, mostly inflicted by the careers on each other while sparring and occasionally on the rare smaller tribute that attempted to take them on. However, Agate and Cornelia appeared slightly unsettled to see several outlying tributes, including the pairs from 7, 8, 9, and 11, with their heads together in a corner, clearly discussing something intently and occasionally looking around with furtive glances to see if anyone else was watching. At one point, Carrie and Lorday attempted to join the conversation, but were accidentally jostled out of the way when the careers brushed past on their way to the archery station. As the 3-day period drew to a close, the tributes prepared to demonstrate their existing and newfound talents for the game makers. Agate was the first tribute in the lineup, swaggering into the demonstration area with a casual bravado. He announced to the Game Maker team that he would be fending off holograms with nothing but a pocket knife, raising several eyebrows amid the Game Makers, as head Game Makers Locke and Locke instructed for holograms to be released into the room. Agate instantly dropped to the floor and rolled left as the holograms charged at him, using his momentum to throw himself upward back to his feet and mercilessly sliced through hologram after hologram. He stood back up after a few minutes, nearly breathless but still managing to retain a bright smile. The Game Makers appeared impressed and made hasty notes in their notepads. Cornelia was up next, selecting a mining pick and turning around rapidly while holding it out from her. After a few moments, as if completing a hammer throw sporting event, Cornelia swung the mining pick out and around her, where it flew around the room and knocked over every single spear on the weaponry racks. She broke out in a grin and dusted off her hands before striding out, not even bothering to look back at the Game Makers. It was not Carrie's turn until much later on in the lineup for the day, but he put on a fairly well-done weightlifting demonstration. However, he dropped a weight on his toe by accident from his nerves during the display, and hopped around on one leg while swearing, causing the Game Makers to wince from their observation booth. Lorday went shortly after, and surprised the Game Makers with her keen knowledge of edible plants after studying at the station, correctly identifying 40 out of 45 pictures shown to her. The hotly anticipated scores were released later in the night, announced via a special broadcast on Rosalia Sanchez's evening program. As predicted, careers and strong outliers scored near the top, though there were some surprises. Topping the lineup was Pompeo from 2 with a score of 11, followed closely by Agate from 1, Megan from 2, Russell from 8, and Collard from 11 with scores of 10. Forrest from 7, Mathieu from 15, and Zélie from 15 were all closely behind with scores of 9. This was not considered a surprise, as Forrest was the brother of last year's victor, Oakley Barbosa, and the resourceful tributes from 15 had been predicted to fare well this year as usual. Cornelia earned a respectable 8 for her demonstration, while Carrie scored just below with a 7 and Lorday a 6. Rounding off the bottom of the group was Rachel from 3 with only a 2. While it was known at this point that Alexander Nicolai and Heifer Muller had 2 slightly different mentoring styles, both victors were in agreement about their tributes' need to go to bed immediately following the announcement of the demonstration scores. Without accepting any questions, comments, concerns, or complaints, both of them steered their respective mentees to bed for the night in preparation for their interviews the following evening and subsequent final night before the games. Rosalia Sanchez greeted the assembled Capitol studio audience in a glamorous dress of cascading layers designed to mimic the terraced rice paddies of the previous year. She waved regally around at them and smiled, eager to welcome her first guest of the night. Cornelia was up first in a brilliant scarlet dress studded with tiny rubies, which Rosalia and the crowd admired and encouraged her to twirl around in. Cornelia was nervous but composed in her interview, earning sympathetic noises from the Capitol audience upon revealing that she had never expected that she would ever be chosen for the games, being so young and an ordinary mine worker. At the end of her interview, several thoroughly charmed Capitolites tossed red roses and chrysanthemums in her direction. Agate was the perfect gentleman in a ruby-covered crimson suit, complimenting Rosalia and offering a few knowing winks to the front row of the audience throughout his interview. He continued to flatter her even as she wrapped up the interview, commenting that she looked ravishing in her dress, and that if he were a pheasant he would be lucky to peck that. This joke with unfortunate implications was hastily laughed off by the thoroughly entertained audience, and Agate was cheered off the stage. At the far end of the lineup, once most tributes for the evening had been interviewed, Lorday stepped out onto the stage in a white dress glittering with small themed accents, including a rancher belt and tall brown cowboy boots. Lourdes was shy but sweet in her interview, with Rosalia occasionally having to ask her to repeat herself due to her quietness. She avoided eye contact with everyone in the crowd and only glanced at the camera once, appearing quite relieved to be done with the interview once Rosalia thanked her for her time and dismissed her. Carrie hurried in after her, wearing a bright white suit that seemed to mimic a cowboy costume and boots to match those belonging to Lourdes. His easy grace and charm in the interview instantly endeared him to both Rosalia and the audience, relieving Heifer and lowering his considerably high blood pressure after the events of the parade and his tribute's average training scores. As Carrie departed the stage, waving generously to his fans in the audience, Rosalia welcomed head game makers Locke and Locke on stage for their yearly pre-games interview. The head game makers promised that they had several surprises planned for this year, including one very special event that they expected would stir speculation and excitement around Panem. They looked at each other upon saying this with knowing grins, turning back to Rosalia and the audience in time to be cheered off the stage. Public opinion of these game makers had so far been quite high, riding the wave of success from their past 3 games, so it was expected that they had more surprises planned for viewers across the nation. It was a tense night that followed the interviews, due to many tributes' nerves and anxiety keeping them up late. It was not uncommon that evening to hear distant retching over balconies or hushed voices attempting to console sobbing ones. Many mentors were notably exhausted the following morning, having stayed up late into the night caring for or reassuring their tributes. Neither Alexander nor Heifer seemed to have this problem, but there were noticeable dark circles around Heifer's eyes when he greeted his tributes that suggested he himself had not enjoyed a good night's rest. All tributes were rounded up to be taken to their lunchrooms for the morning after a brief breakfast, most looking quite ill or apprehensive. The tribute outfits for this year were seen to be lightweight white tanks along with khaki-fitted pants and brown leather boots. Several mentors, including both Heifer and a surprisingly alert-looking Alexander, reminded their tributes that they were very likely going to be in a warm location or indoors. Inside the lunchroom, Alexander clapped Agate on the back, though he seemed slightly startled by his tribute's eagerness and the way he lightly shifted his weight from foot to foot while cracking his neck as he entered the tube. Alexander attempted to offer Cornelia a handshake, but she hugged him instead, eyes wide and fearful but determined. Heifer visited Lourdes and gruffly told her to keep her head up, while awkwardly patting her. When he visited Carrie, the pair huddled to speak in low and urgent tones before Carrie nodded and entered his tube, saluting to his mentor amid a rare worried look from Heifer. The podiums then slowly rose upward. Immediately, tributes' heads on all sides swiveled around to take everything around them in. They were standing in the central courtyard of an island fort, situated in the middle of a seemingly never-ending ocean. A long, circular boardwalk structure ran along the outside of the fort. It was a pleasantly warm day, with a gentle breeze tussling the tributes' hair and ruffling their clothes while they scanned the area. The 24 podiums were all stationed around the central courtyard in the middle of the fort, allowing tributes the option to run forward to the Cornucopia in the center, or flee to the safety of the fort or boardwalk. Stored in the Cornucopia was a variety of weapons, survival supplies, and medical supplies, but no food or water was anywhere to be seen. Most appeared generally unsettled by the lack of food and water provided to them, brows furrowing and lips pursing in concentration as they attempted to think their way out of this dilemma. Few tributes had any chance to think, however, as the countdown soon concluded and many were startled off their podiums. Shockingly, to the surprise of not just Rosalia and the commentators, but many Capital and District viewers, most tributes chose to run inward on the slim chance that there could possibly be a single water bottle or can of food hidden somewhere within, and not wanting to rely on the slim chance of sponsorship. Carrie and Lourdes held hands as they ran forward to try and find something of use to them, shielding their heads and eyes from the sun with their free hands. Agate and Cornelia glanced over to Pompeo and Megan, the group silently communicating to fan out in order to divide and conquer the tributes running toward the Cornucopia. It was indeed Megan who achieved the first kill of the 109th games, grinning viciously as she seized a spear from inside the Cornucopia and thrust it through the neck of the panicking girl from 5. Megan then leaped onto the girl and attempted to disembowel her with the tip of the spear, causing Cornelia to turn slightly green while holding a hand to her mouth, and Pompeo and Agate to wrench the spear away from her, shouting that she was wasting time. Each of the careers continued to fan out, though this time Pompeo kept a closer eye on Megan. Viella, from 8, was the next to fall, as Agate grabbed a sword from the center and stabbed it into her face. Carrie and Lorday had encountered an obstacle upon reaching a set of throwing knives, in that the boy from 9 was also interested in these knives and had just closed his hands around them as they approached. Lorday tugged on Carrie's arm and told him that they would just need to leave the knives alone, but he shook his head and seized the boy from behind, snapping his neck in a single smooth motion. Carrie handed the knives to Lorday and they fled the courtyard, not daring to get into any more conflicts over supplies. Suddenly, from the commentator booth, Rosalia Sanchez shrieked in surprise and quickly called for her co-host's attention. It appeared as though there was an enormous fight brewing in the center of the courtyard between the careers and the remaining tributes from Districts 7, 8, 9, and 11. Neither commentators nor viewers could tell if the fight was spontaneous or if it had been a planned attack by one of the groups on the other, though within moments it became clear that it was a planned ambush by the outliers that had been whispering in the training center. The scuffle had grown so large that it was nearly impossible to tell who was who, as other tributes looked back in shock while running away. Agate was pinned down by Forrest and his district partner Holly, and impaled with an axe through the heart, killing him soon after. Pompeo and Megan slashed at the outliers, eyes wide in surprise and perhaps even a little bit of fear. Megan managed to successfully kill Apricot from 11, and began to joke about stealing her appendages to use as a necklace, but all the blood had quickly drained from her face, and she seemed too worried to enjoy the kill as much as she had with the girl from 5. The careers fought well, but they were no match for the muscular pair from 7 as well as their allies in 8, 9, and 11. Collard from 11 aimed a well-timed kick at Pompeo's groin, sending him crashing to the ground and swiftly decapitating him with a sword seconds later. Cornelia watched, paralyzed with fear, only to realize that the group had been ignoring her and had evidently mistaken her for Zélie from 15, who also had bright red hair. Heaving and in a panic, Cornelia snatched a dagger off the grass and fled the courtyard, glancing behind her and watching in fright as Megan was slaughtered by the efforts of the outlier pack. Realizing she was the only career remaining, Cornelia sprinted into the fort to avoid any further contact with the ruthless outlier alliance. Carrie and Lorday had successfully laid claim to the set of throwing knives and were running away from the courtyard, hand in hand and stumbling occasionally on rocks or bumpy ground. Just as they reached the very edge and were about to cross into the relative safety of the fort, Mathieu and Zélie from 15 leaped out at them from behind a bush, each armed with a set of nunchucks. Lorday screamed and backpedaled, attempting to find a different entrance to the fort, but Carrie stood his ground and brandished the throwing knives at the pair in a threatening manner. However, due to Lorday's tugging in the opposite direction, he was dragged backward and wheeled his arms in a panic to stay upright. Mathieu chose this moment to strike. Despite being in closer proximity to Carrie, Mathieu cleverly struck at Lorday instead, evidently deeming Carrie's bigger size, armed status, and flailing arms as too much of a danger. He then utilized the nunchucks in a rather unconventional way, rapping Lorday sharply across the head with one of its sticks and knocking her in a dizzy heap to the ground. Zélie proceeded to engage Carrie in combat while Mathieu bashed at the prone Lorday and strangled her with the nunchuck chain. Her cannon sounded seconds later as he stood back up and cracked his knuckles, preparing to take on the struggling Carrie alongside his district partner. The outlier pack that had so efficiently dispatched 75% of the career pack in the Bloodbath began to regroup near the Cornucopia, prowling around and searching for other tributes. The alliance split up into a buddy system of sorts, with groups consisting of Forrest from 7 and Kira from 9, Holly from 7 and Russell from 8, and Collard from 11 by himself. This allowed them to more efficiently cover ground in the courtyard and hunt down any threats who might have hidden in the surrounding trees in order to escape the wrath of the ambitious alliance. It was Collard who first shouted in surprise as he spotted the girl from 4 hurrying toward the ocean. Forrest coldly encouraged him to pursue the girl before she got to the ocean, reminding his ally that she would be much deadlier in the water than on land. Collard appeared to realize this at the same time as his ally was saying it, and took off as if he were a jumpy racehorse at the starting line, according to Rosalia Sanchez. The girl from 4 was fast, but Collard had not received one of the highest training scores for nothing, and he quickly apprehended her before brutally tackling her to the ground and impaling her with a long knife. The girl cried out in pain as Collard withdrew the knife and cleaned it off on his shirt, her cannon soon sounding. The rest of the outlier pack applauded Collard upon his return, as he was clapped on the back by Forrest and Russell and hugged by Holly and Kira. The group continued to see another success a few minutes later, spotting Rachel from 3 trying unsuccessfully to climb a tree and falling out in front of them. A swift sword to the neck by Holly assured Rachel would not be climbing any more trees in the future unless they were made for ghosts. Meanwhile, across the courtyard and obscured by some trees, Carrie was in the middle of fending off both tributes from 15 at the same time, brow glistening with sweat and tension at the loss of his district partner and the effort of fighting the 15s. Carrie sliced the throwing knives through the air with reckless abandon, wildly missing both his opponents but managing to snag on the chain of Zéli's nunchucks and send them flying across the courtyard. This freed up an opportunity for Carrie to fight Mathieu one-on-one, while Zélie scurried after her lost weapons, the two boys clashing amid gritting teeth and screeching metal. Suddenly, both boys, as well as most of the other tributes in the arena, were distracted by what seemed to be a great shadow flying above them. It was revealed to tributes as well as viewers that the shadow in fact belonged to a flock of brilliantly colored parakeets, sailing smoothly in formation above the arena, their feathers shown in varying shades of red, yellow, green, and blue. Many tributes quickly became mesmerized by the beautiful colors of the birds' feathers, distracting all but the most determined of the group. Mathieu and Zélie both gazed in wonder and awe up at the bird's spectacular tail feathers, unknowingly providing a determined Carrie with the opportunity to grab onto his remaining knives and sprint off into the fort. The pair from 15 immediately panicked upon noticing their fascination had cost them a valuable chance to take out the competition, scrambling to retrieve their nunchucks and chase after him. However, it was too late, as Carrie had already made himself scarce and was nowhere to be seen. Not wanting to exhaust themselves unnecessarily by chasing after him, especially with no food or water, the 15s accepted their defeat for the time being. The arrival of the parakeets had disrupted more than just violent encounters in the arena. The outlier pack members, who had been busying themselves with setting up camp in the center of the courtyard, paused to admire the gliding birds as they passed over the open center of the fort. This momentary distraction caused Kira to accidentally hit Russell's hand with a mallet while attempting to pitch a tent and pound the tent stakes into the ground. Russell cried out in pain and anger, almost instinctively reaching out with his free hand, which contained a dagger, and slashing it at Kira, who was leaning forward in his direction. Holly screamed, while Forrest and Collard lunged at Russell to stop him from doing any further damage. However, the slash he had accidentally aimed at Kira had gashed across the front of her neck, striking her carotid artery. She gasped, clutching her throat as her eyes popped, and heaved rapidly as blood gushed out of her neck. Russell yelped and flapped his hands in distress, dropping the bloody dagger to the ground while his allies scrambled to find a medical kit to help their ally. Despite the several pairs of eyes searching for a medical kit, when Holly finally located one, it was a mere first aid kit and not adequate enough to handle a serious and potentially fatal injury like the slashed artery in Kira's neck. While Forrest and Holly attempted to do everything within their power to save Kira, Collard gave Russell the scolding of a century, cautioning him to be more careful with handling weapons around camp. Camillo Anderson commented that Russell looked like a dog caught with its tail between its legs, to which Rosalia crudely replied that when Collard was done with him, it was unlikely Russell would have anything between his legs. The rest of their allies shook their heads as Kira's cannon sounded and she was airlifted out, each one eyeing Russell with distrust and caution. In spite of the chaotic events of the afternoon, evening soon fell upon the arena without much ceremony at all. Cornelia had spent the afternoon scavenging around her corner of the fort, mentally recovering from the panic during the bloodbath and trying to refocus on her more important objectives, such as obtaining food and water. She had successfully located a nearly empty barrel that contained a small amount of what appeared to be rainwater, but seemed to be apprehensive about sampling it in the off chance it was contaminated. Being a poor miner, Cornelia was prepared for needing to go several days without food, but already the stress and exertion of the afternoon had begun to take its toll. Cornelia curled into a ball under a staircase in the fort, holding her dagger in one hand and sleeping with one eye open for most of the evening. Several times, the quiet footsteps of other tributes could be heard in the hallway as they made their way around while exploring the fort, but none drew near enough to Cornelia's staircase to give her cause for concern. Rosalia noted that Cornelia appeared to be shedding a few tears throughout the evening, stating that this was unexpected for a career. Across the arena, in a different area of the fort, Carrie peered out from a second-floor open-air window at the dock below, where he could see Shirame from 4 and Jay from 5 talking quietly and dipping their legs in the water. Carrie observed them with apprehension, noting how easily Shirame submerged himself in the water and obtained a fish within minutes. Carrie then waited until the sun had begun to set and the two boys had laid down to take a short nap before sneaking back down the winding staircase and into the water. Copying Shirame's technique from earlier in the day, albeit with less grace and precision, Carrie succeeded in catching a single fish before he realized his splashing had caused Jay to stir behind him. He skittered out of the water and back into the fort just as Jay sat up, relishing his small victory and preparing the fish with one of his remaining throwing knives. Night slowly fell over the arena as the anthem of Panem played and the portraits of the fallen flashed across the inky black night sky. The many portraits of Agate from 1, Pompeo and Megan from 2, Rachel from 3, the girl from 4, the girl from 5, Vayella from 8, both from 9, Lourdes from 10, and Apricot from 11 were shown, to the shock of many tributes. Seeing so many portraits flash across the sky, those remaining realized that there had been 11 deaths on just the first day, meaning there were only 13 tributes left. This seemed to be a chilling thought to most, though some seemed reassured by the lower amount of competition still alive. A cool and windy night swept the arena, chilling those who did not have the cover of a tent or blanket from the Cornucopia. Cornelia hibernated under the stairs, shivering, her lips trembling slightly. To viewers, she appeared to be either quite cold or quite terrified, or perhaps a mix of both. Carrie had enjoyed his seafood dinner but was suffering the negative effects of eating raw fish flesh, heaving into a bush in the courtyard. By the time morning arose, he appeared quite exhausted and ill. Carrie returned to the second floor of the fort, only to find a loud argument occurring on the dock below. A pair of angry voices drifted up to him, amplified by the gently rolling waves. The pair from earlier, Shirame and Jay, had begun to argue about Shirame hogging a sleeping bag they had managed to swipe from the Cornucopia during the bloodbath. They each tugged at a different strap on the sleeping bag, trying to claim it for themselves and bickering. Carrie slyly grinned to himself and cast around to find the old fish bones from his meal the previous evening. Squinting through the darkness, he selected a fish bone and leveled it at Shirame's head before hurling it as energetically as he could muster. The bone sailed through the air and sharply rapped Shirame across the top of his head, causing him to cry out in pain and clutch at it. Shirame quickly recovered and angrily accused Jay of throwing the fishbone from their leftover stash, though Jay denied the accusation and counter-accused Shirame of being dramatic. The two boys dropped the sleeping bag and charged at each other, falling to the dock planks amid a flurry of fists and flailing limbs. Carrie watched from above while leaning against a brick wall, smiling indulgently and picking his teeth with another fishbone. Despite his weary appearance, it seemed as though having started a beachfront brawl had considerably restored his spirits, and he even chuckled as Shirame overpowered Jay and hurled him off the dock into the water. Diving into the water and holding Jay's head under, Shirame did not release his firm grip until the other boy's body sank and his cannon sounded. Carrie's laugh quickly faded to an awkward grimace. As the sun rose at dawn, head game makers Lock and Lock greeted the remaining tributes with a morning announcement that boomed out over the arena. Since most tributes had not yet managed to obtain any food, and to the tribute's surprise it was revealed that there had been a food sponsoring ban for the entire first day and night, the head game makers declared that a tiered tower of food would rise into the center of the arena. The tower of food would contain 10 tiers, with less desirable food items like bread loaves and expiring vegetables on the larger, lower levels, and more desirable items such as capital delicacies and nutritious food on the smaller, higher levels. In addition, to create a challenge for those who wanted the more desirable foods, traps would be placed throughout the tower to discourage too many tributes from trying to scale the entire structure and claim all of the best food for themselves. Though many tributes had been feeling the effects of a lack of food, there was a noticeable heightening in energy as the game makers made this announcement. Cornelia, who had been pale and withdrawn from the start of the announcement, gripped her dagger and slowly picked herself up with a sharp glint in her eye. She squared her shoulders and moved toward the edge of the clearing, her survival instincts kicking in above her weariness. Across the fort, Carrie looked in disgust at the remains of his ill-fated fish dinner and prepared his throwing knives, clearly hoping to score some food that did not cause him to vomit over the side of the fort. Overall, it appeared as though the entire arena was bristling with excitement for the opportunity to take a stab at the Tower of Food, and also potentially at any other tributes in the area. The head game makers then declared that the Tower of Food would rise 5 minutes after the conclusion of their announcement. Viewers could see the many curious pairs of eyes appearing at various different points across the courtyard, scanning the area and carefully eyeing the central space near the Cornucopia. After 5 minutes' time, the tribute's jaws slowly dropped as a great gaping circle opened in the ground near the Cornucopia, and a strikingly tall tower rose from the center. To the amazement of many, Valletta from 6 sprinted out while the tower was still rising, snagged a platter of sumptuous buttered crescent rolls from an upper tier that had barely risen a foot above the ground, and scooted off in the opposite direction. again. Several other tributes appeared quite jealous, wishing they had thought of this idea themselves. However, no one else dared to make a move until the tower had fully risen. At once, a flurry of tributes descended upon the center of the courtyard, charging in and attempting to scale the structure like a rock-climbing course. It seemed as though every single remaining tribute had turned out for a crack at the Tower of Food, resulting in several smaller brawls before anyone even reached the tower itself. Zélie struck Talon from 6 with a fist to the face, breaking the boy's nose before he could lay claim to the same roast chicken leg that Zélie had been eyeing up herself. The chicken leg, which had been in Talon's hand, soared over Zélie's head and landed in a nearby bush, causing her to greedily scamper after it and abandon the rest of the chaos unfolding at the Tower of Food. The Outlier Pack were some of the first tributes to arrive at the tower and began scaling it, each member claiming one side to loot. Right on their heels were Shirame and Carrie from the eastern side, Mathieu from the northern side, Cecil from 3 from the western side, and Cornelia from the southern side. Mathieu was the first to strike, leaping up onto Forrest's back and trying to pull him off the structure. At once, what appeared to be a large red boxing glove, later dubbed the Boxing Glove of Doom by commentators, emerged from within the tower and sucker-punched Forrest backward 10 feet off the structure, painfully squishing Mathieu underneath him. Forrest seized this opportunity to gouge into Mathieu's eye with the tip of his knife, making him cry out in pain as he twisted it further in. Forrest angrily continued to stab into both his eyes despite his cries of protest, holding in his own heaving due to his stomach pain from the boxing glove. Mathieu's cannon sounded just seconds later as the irritated Forrest leaped back onto the Tower of Food and began trying to scale it again. Shirame and Carrie, one after another, jumped onto the side of the tower and tried to grab anything they could from the rotating food carousel, though Shirame was accidentally kicked in the face by Collard, who was swatting at a flurry of parakeet mutts that had come zooming out of the side of the structure when he tried to take a grilled panini. The parakeets twittered in a manner that almost sounded like they were calling Collard a panini head, taunting him and flitting around his head. Collard became so enraged at the parakeets that he threatened to cook and marinate them for dinner, though his argument with a group of birds appeared quite foolish to Capitol viewers, who whispered and chuckled to themselves in Mace Square. Shirame clutched his face in pain at having been kicked, but shook it off and kept trying to stockpile more food from the middle levels. Carrie was right behind, stuffing bread loaves in his pants pockets and seizing a water bottle, which he chugged from and then poured the remainder down his shirt to cool off. Just as Shirame reached the same level as Collard, a trapdoor opened and stuck out a clothing hook, snagging his shirt and suspending him up in the air while dangling perilously above the ground. Collard looked over and saw him, grinning at his plight. Shirame had hardly a moment to process his situation when Collard leaned over and sliced across his throat with his sword, toppling him off the side of the tower and sounding his cannon as an uncomfortable sound best described as a crunching or snapping was heard. Other tributes continued to climb the tower, undeterred by the outliers or the traps placed along the way. Cornelia swiped a few loaves of bread and some water from the very bottom row, having changed her mind about getting too adventurous after seeing what had just happened to a multitude of other ambitious tributes. Just as she skirted away, she witnessed Holly snapping Cecil's neck over a picnic basket, wincing as the boy's body was carried off. Carrie was forced to stab Talon through the face when the boy, still clutching his injured nose from his earlier conflict with Zélie, tried to attack him and steal the jar of peanut butter he was holding. However, the Outlier Pack was not without its losses. Russell fell victim to one of the deadlier traps set within the tower, a spear that came whistling out of its side and impaled him through the stomach, sounding his cannon as he lay in pain on the ground. His allies, while appearing slightly concerned at his death, were still irritated after the incident with Kira earlier and did not seem overly bothered, but it was Holly whose sudden fall took Forrest and Collard by surprise. Gritting her teeth with determination and reaching far into the rotating food carousel to try and grab a charcuterie board, Holly overbalanced and fell forward onto the carousel itself. Immediately, that level of the tower began spinning faster and faster while she clung for dear life to its surface. Holly screamed as she frantically tried to get up and escape the spinning tower level, waving her hands to get Forrest or Collard to help her, but the boys appeared too afraid to venture toward her. Within just seconds, the tower ejected Holly from its depths, where she fell nearly 40 feet from its higher levels and slammed into the ground with such force that all of the food she had been carrying flew out of her hands and landed several feet away. A moment later, her cannon sounded. The voices of head game makers Lock and Lock soon were heard booming over the arena once more, announcing that the Tower of Food would be retracting in 1 minute and that it was advisable for any tributes remaining in its area to leave if they did not want to die a painful death. Forrest and Collard, looking over at each other, nodded and quickly vacated the area after climbing down from the structure. Carrie leaped down to the ground and scooted off, not wishing to see what the tower might do to him if he were to stay behind. All other tributes had already left the tower area at this time, meaning the tower safely and uneventfully retreated back underground. Cordelia Breen noted from the commentary booth that while preliminary death counters were still being verified, it was believed that there were now only 6 tributes remaining. Many viewers around the capital and Panem appeared curious to see how the remaining tributes would fare, especially now that they had all obtained food from the tower. All of those remaining had scattered in different directions, leaving the courtyard deserted. Cornelia had skittered all the way out to a small beach at the southern end of the fort, and was busy crossing from the beach to the long boardwalk as the camera circled around. Her red hair, formerly shiny and well-kept, had grown frizzy in its ponytail from humidity and puffed out from her head. It was clear to viewers that she had been thinking on her feet for most of the game so far, especially after the surprise attack by the Outliers in the Bloodbath, destroying any chance she had of working with her career allies. Cornelia did not stop running until she had reached the intersection of 2 segments of the boardwalk, which she deemed a satisfying distance from any other tributes. She hungrily nibbled on one of her bread loaves and sipped water from a canteen, then splashed some seawater on her face to remove some of the sweat and dirt. Cornelia then buried her head between her knees in apparent exhaustion, the exertion of the games and their emotional toll finally weighing fully on her. A few lone tears spilled down her salty cheeks as her shoulders shook with emotion, realizing that it was unlikely she would be sponsored any gifts with her lack of a career attitude, before clenching her fists and slowly standing back up, forcing herself to her feet and to keep going. For the rest of the afternoon and evening, she kept a watch out for other tributes while washing her clothing in the ocean and sheltering under the boardwalk. The beating sun and sweltering arena had certainly affected all those remaining, especially smaller tributes like Cornelia. Across the arena, Carrie helped himself to a dollop of peanut butter on top of her bread roll, luxuriating in his new food supply from the tower. He watched the gently rolling waves in the distance from his second-floor hideout in the fort, letting them lull him into a peaceful nap for the rest of the afternoon. There were no further confrontations or deaths for the rest of the day, as both the game makers and the public were satisfied with the amount of bloodshed at the Tower of Food that had occurred in the early afternoon. The remaining tributes settled down for the evening to eat their winnings and rest, watching the portraits of the fallen flick across the night sky. Carrie awoke from his nap just in time to see the faces of Cecil and Rachel from 3, both tributes from 4, Jay from 5, Talon from 6, Holly from 7, Russell from 8, Kira from 9, and Mathieu from 15 displayed above him. Since his nap had lasted into the night, Carrie found it extremely difficult to sleep after the showing of the portraits, and decided to explore around the arena instead while he could do so undetected, under cover of darkness. After a while of walking around the fort itself, he grew tired of pacing the stone floors and ventured around into some of the smaller groundskeeping buildings at the edges of the courtyard. While these are mostly empty and clearly not intended for tribute's use as anything other than a temporary shelter, Carrie did manage to locate a small gardening spade in a drawer and pocketed it alongside his throwing knives. He continued around the courtyard and eventually moved to one of the fort's towers that extended out into the water. Just as Carrie turned a corner, he froze, noticing that Forrest and Collard were directly in front of him and talking quietly about their home districts. The boys immediately looked up and saw him standing in the archway, eyes wide. Slowly they stood with their weapons and stalked toward him, eyeing him with great suspicion and distrust. Carrie began to panic, and the boys raised their weapons together, preparing to strike. Yet instead of attacking Carrie, at the last second Forrest lowered his own weapon and reached a hand out to force Collard to do the same. Still regarding him with suspicion, Forrest reasoned that they could use another ally for the moment, considering there were still other tributes left and they had just lost 2 allies to the Tower of Food. Carrie exhaled a sigh of relief and joined the boys at their small campsite for the night, thrilled to have his own sleeping bag. The moment he laid his head down for the night, Forrest and Collard glanced at each other through the dark and exchanged sly grins before settling down for the night as well. The rest of the night passed without incident, as did the following morning. Most tributes were still recovering from the physical and mental strain of the Tower of Food, resulting in Capitol viewers quickly becoming bored from the lack of action. Carrie continued to camp out with Forrest and Collard, though there seemed to be a slightly tense atmosphere as the 3 boys shared a light breakfast and chatted about the other living tributes. Out at the dock, Cornelia was startled from her sleep in the late morning to find a small girl standing over her and nibbling on one of her bread loaves. This was revealed to be Valletta, the girl from 6, peering curiously down at her. Cornelia screamed and struggled to her feet, waving around her dagger with reckless abandon as Valletta flailed her arms and tried to get out of the way. Cornelia then demanded to know why Valletta had been watching her sleep and stealing her food, to which Valletta calmly replied that she had just stumbled upon her while taking a casual walk. Cornelia irritably muttered in response that it seemed unusual for her to have stumbled on a deserted boardwalk intersection on a casual walk, though Valletta simply grinned and crunched on the end of a stale baguette. The girl from one side and reluctantly suggested that they ally, considering the lack of tributes remaining. Just as the girls hesitantly shook hands and sat down to dangle their feet in the water, they heard a distant cannon. This was seen to belong to Zélie from 15, who had succumbed to heat stroke and thirst after failing to obtain any water from the Tower of Food the previous day. With only 5 tributes left on just the 3rd day, and the sun drenching the arena in heat, all those remaining seemed fatigued and lethargic for most of the day. Rosalia speculated that perhaps the game makers would put a giant fan over the arena to cool the tributes off and create some more action. Yet the arena remained stiflingly hot for the rest of the day. The Girls' Alliance tentatively shared stories from their home districts with each other while taking a light swim in the ocean, and found it surprising that they had much in common despite their different personalities. Both came from less privileged backgrounds, Cornelia coming from a mining family and Valletta from a family of factory workers, and supported multiple younger siblings. Though Valletta was only younger than Cornelia by 2 years, the girls bonded over Cornelia remarking that Valletta reminded her of her younger sister, Rubica. They continued to cool off in the water and snack on some of their remaining food for the rest of the afternoon, enjoying playing a game of who could imitate Rosalia Sanchez's announcer voice most accurately, though it was cut short when Cornelia declared that she was experiencing some sunburn and hurried to shelter under the boardwalk. Meanwhile, across the fort at the boys' camp, evening had begun to set in as the Outlier boys prepared a small dinner. Viewers could practically feel the tension radiating off the scene before them. While Forrest and Collard busied themselves with allocating each ally part of a turkey and some vegetables with peanut butter, Carrie arranged the sleeping bags and stared distractedly out across the endless ocean. Suddenly, a small silver parachute plunked down on the windowsill in front of him, startling him out of his deep thought. However, he quickly recovered once he realized Forrest and Collard could turn around and look at any moment, hastily unwrapping the parachute and stuffing it into his pants pocket. Contained within the parachute were 2 items, a small vial and a slip of paper. Carrie read the paper to himself first, and the camera zoomed in so that it was visible to audiences. The slip was a note, reading, 5 left, keep moving, use this to drop them a surprise, and was signed with a dark H that appeared to almost be slashed into the paper. In the corner of the note was a tiny illustration showing a small picture of the vial that had been sent to Carrie. Emerging from the vial in the drawing were a few drops, which were shown to land on a few small items that resembled food and water canteens. Carrie slowly raised his eyes from the note and pocketed it, gazing out at the ocean once more. It was at this time that Forrest prodded him in the back to get him to join the other boys for dinner, to which Carrie quickly nodded and turned around to sit. His eyes darted around during their meal as if searching for opportunities, flicking back and forth whenever Forrest or Collard picked up a canteen or bit into a piece of turkey or vegetables. At last, while Forrest was quietly relating a story about the time he tricked his brother into eating a pine cone by telling him it was a delicious dessert, Carrie noticed that both of the other boys were looking away while laughing about the anecdote. In a flash, his hand shot into his pants pocket and back out, withdrawing the vial and dashing it against the top of the other boys' water canteens. By the time they looked back, the vial was already back in his pocket and he was reaching for a bread roll. Collard casually swigged from his water canteen a few minutes later, though Forrest seemed uninterested in drinking from his own. The boys' dinner was interrupted by the anthem of Panem and the face of Zélie from 15 flashing across the night sky. As the anthem faded out and the boys began to settle down for the night, with Carrie taking the first night watch, Collard suddenly stood while holding a hand to his mouth. In the pale moonlight, viewers could see a bead of sweat forming on his brow as he swayed slightly. As Carrie watched in surprise and Forrest peered out from his sleeping bag, Collard dashed over to the open-air window and noisily vomited over the side into the ocean. Forrest stared in surprise and asked Collard if he had eaten something spoiled, to which he shook his head and vomited again. It appeared as though he was trying to say something, but could not due to his constant retching and heaving. Carrie looked around wildly for a moment, apparently making a split-second decision, and drew one of his throwing knives from his pocket, before stabbing it into the bent-over collard's back and shoving his vulnerable body over the side of the tower into the ocean. Carrie then hastily fled the scene, hearing Forrest's shout of anger and surprise behind him and his footsteps in hot pursuit. The chase continued for several minutes as Carrie sprinted through the fort and tried to deflect the several small knives thrown by Forrest. One knife glanced off his arm, leaving a bloody slash mark across the back of his forearm, but Carrie was able to recover and managed to shake Forrest off by diving into a bush and waiting for him to run past. Away from the action at the peaceful outer docks, Cornelia had just helped Valletta fall asleep and was settling down herself when both girls were startled awake by the cannon belonging to Collard. This shook them enough to keep them awake for much longer, and they quietly chatted and speculated about who could be left. The girls failed to notice a slight fluttering above them as they talked, until a few minutes later when something light and delicate drifted down onto Valletta's shoulder, and Cornelia leaned over to pick it off. Raising her eyes up behind Valletta, Cornelia's jaw dropped as she jabbed a finger at the top of the fort's battlements nearby. Valletta turned and shrieked, flapping her arms in fright, but Cornelia clamped a hand over her mouth and shushed her. Perched atop the battlements was a line of brightly colored parakeets, staring intently down at the girls and cocking their heads in an eerie manner. Breathing heavily but not daring to make any further noise, the girls slowly packed up their belongings and prepared to run, skittering down the boardwalk towards one of the small landing beaches that connected them to the fort. They soon realized that not only was one of the battlements lined with parakeets, but all of the roofs on the entire fort were now home to the eerily staring birds. Eventually, as Valletta began to panic that the birds were waiting for them to do something unknown before attacking, while Cornelia studied them carefully from afar and tried to determine if they were dangerous, the girls realized that they were wearing themselves out and that it would be best to get some sleep anyway. All 4 remaining tributes finally settled down to rest for the night, Carrie inside a bush after successfully shaking off his pursuer, a reluctant Forrest up in a tree, and Cornelia and Valletta camping out on the beach. When they awoke in the morning, it was to a remarkably loud announcement from the head game makers. Head game makers Lock and Lock declared that while they were asleep, a large red fabric square had been attached to the back of the tributes' shirts, easily recognizable to the parakeets gathering in the arena. The head game makers also revealed that parakeets despise the color red and would readily attack any object or person displaying the color. Upon hearing this, Cornelia and Valletta panicked and tried to remove the red squares from their backs, but found that they were sealed tightly to the tank tops. Carrie removed his shirt, but found that the red dye from the fabric had bled through onto his back as a result of this, and there was still a large red mark on his back. The head game makers added that even if tributes removed their shirts, they would still have red on them, and that the parakeets would continue to pursue anyone with red on them. They also graciously warned the 4 remaining tributes that these parakeet mutts had lethally sharp claws. With a casual "toodles," the head game makers signed off and patiently waited for the chaos to begin. At once, the massive flocks of parakeets descended from the fort roof in all directions, creating a tornado of colors and flapping wings as they spiraled out towards the 4 tributes. Cornelia's sunburn from the previous day had become intensely inflamed overnight, and she winced in pain and agony as she struggled to her feet. Valletta, who had not been as adversely affected, helped her ally up, and the girls struggled to get to the safety and shade of the fort. The moment they entered one of the towers from another dock, Cornelia collapsed in pain from the sunburn and shielded her eyes to watch the birds circling around the fort and searching for them. Valletta steered them along, always keeping their backs to the fort wall behind them to disguise Cornelia's red hair against the walls while they inched past windows and tunnels. Carrie had hoped that his hiding place inside a bush would protect him, but the parakeets could see through the leaves and quickly descended on him, attempting to gash him with their sharp talons. Carrie fought his way out of the bush and tore across the courtyard clearing as quickly as he could, snatching the vial from his pocket, uncorking it, and hurling it at the flock of parakeets. The rest of its contents spilled on the birds, causing a flurry of twittering and wing flapping, which allowed him to sprint away and shelter in a nearby groundskeeping facility. Carrie shut the door behind him and exhaled a sigh of relief, drawing his gardening spade in the event that any birds managed to follow him. Forrest had taken a different approach and was attempting to fight off all the birds that had attacked him directly, which he managed with surprising success. Commentators noted that he seemed to have the same blunt fighting style as his brother Oakley, although with much more restraint. Inside the fort, the girls continued to edge along the wall as Cornelia grimaced from the increasing level of pain she was experiencing from her sunburn. However, in true career fashion, she powered through the pain and directed Valletta to the second floor, as she told the other girl that she wanted to get a better view of the events in the courtyard. The girls comically inched along the wall and up the stairs as if they were in a low-budget spy movie, according to Rosalia Sanchez. And indeed, this moment was later parodied on late-night Capitol television, with dramatic spy music layered over it to add to the effect. Surveying the courtyard, the girls watched Forrest continue to hack and slash through parakeet after parakeet, splattering the grass with their blood. Cornelia made a disgusted face and quickly covered Valletta's eyes with her hand. Suddenly, she appeared to have an idea and whispered it to Valletta, both girls' eyes lighting up in unison. The pair edged their way along the wall inside the fort until they were nearly above the corner of the courtyard where Forrest was fighting off the parakeets. Inhaling deeply, Cornelia drew her dagger from her pocket as she positioned herself right above Forrest and sliced it across the bottom of her ponytail with the same delicacy as a violinist would weave a bow across the strings of a violin. The ensuing locks of brilliant, fiery red hair spilled down and directly onto Forrest's head as he looked up in bewilderment, only to see a grinning, if slightly sunburnt, Cornelia and Valletta above. Immediately, all of the parakeets that had been circling the area and searching for tributes noticed this beacon of bright red gleaming off the top of Forrest Barbossa's head. He frantically tried to remove the locks of hair from the top of his head as a spooked Cornelia and Valletta skittered off while giggling to themselves about his new look. Courtesy of Cornelia and Valletta's idea, Forrest had now attracted nearly every single parakeet in the entire arena to his location, and they quickly swarmed and overwhelmed him. He glared in frustration, uttering a series of insults at the fleeing girls as they scooted back the way they had come along the fort wall, and continuing to furiously fight the parakeets despite knowing he was gravely outnumbered. At this time, footage cut to the Capitol, where Oakley Barbossa was standing in the mentoring control room and glowering, railing his fists against a desk so hard that it rattled while watching his brother try to take on the fleet of parakeet mutts. Lena Siragon, victor of the 102nd Hunger Games, attempted to put a comforting hand on his shaking shoulder as he gritted his teeth and shouted agitated instructions at Forrest that he knew would never be heard, but his eyes flashed and he slapped her hand away. Hearing his brother's cannon, he slumped in his seat and tiredly snapped his fingers for an AVOX to bring him another shot of gin. He then sent this down next to several empty alcohol bottles and glasses, downing the entire shot in a single gulp. It was clear he had done this many times in the past few days. Cameras then cut back to the arena, where Carrie was peeking out of the groundskeeping building, and Cornelia and Valletta were skirting around the edges of the fort, hand in hand. The parakeet mutts abandoned Forrest as his torn, limp body was carried off by a hovercraft, and immediately began their search for a new target. Swarming the courtyard amid a great clamor of twittering, the parakeets flooded every open space in the arena, sending both the girls into a panic as they looked around to find shelter. Carrie dived back into the groundskeeping building and barricaded all of its doors and windows methodically, curly dark hair pressed against his forehead with sweat, as Cornelia and Valletta screamed at an approaching fleet of colorful parakeets, wings flapping and talons primed for attack. Giving up on trying to conceal their red-covered backs and fleeing through the open halls hand in hand, the girls continued to panic, and Cornelia drew her dagger to attempt to fend off some of the parakeets with her free hand. Suddenly, Valletta tripped on a loose stone and flapped her arms while screaming, falling backward as if in slow motion towards the open window space that overlooked the courtyard. Cornelia shouted her name as Valletta's hand slipped from her own and she stumbled backward, losing her balance and beginning to fall down toward the unforgiving ground below, only for Cornelia's hand to catch hers at the last second. This left the girls in quite a precarious position, Valletta dangling over the side of the ledge and only hanging on to Cornelia's free hand, slipping further down with every passing second as the parakeets neared them. The sweat on the girl's hands was no help, as Cornelia tried desperately to pocket her dagger and use both hands to help her falling ally, but failed. Fingertip by fingertip, the little girl from 6 was slipping away. The parakeets circled around the girls and plunged at them, picking at both girls with their beaks and claws despite their shrieks and kicks. Beads of sweat formed on Cornelia's forehead, and Valletta's eyes widened in fear as both girls cried out in pain from the parakeets picking at them. Valletta's face softened as she noticed the strain and tension on Cornelia's face, the older girl frantically trying to think of a way to save her ally. Valletta whispered Cornelia's name to get her attention, wide brown eyes brimming with tears, but Cornelia shook her head as if understanding already what Valletta was telling her to do, shushing her and promising they would make it out. Yet the parakeets kept diving at the pair and attacking them, picking at their exposed hands and loosening their grip on each other. Valletta pleaded with Cornelia in a hoarse voice and told her ally that she had a better chance of surviving without her anyway, that it was just better to let her fall. Despite this, Cornelia refused and continued holding on. At last, Valletta set her mouth in a thin line and glared. Without another moment to spare, Valletta raised her free hand and weakly scratched Cornelia's arm, startling the other girl enough that she loosened her grip on Valletta's hand. A single second was all it took for their hands to slip apart and lose contact, the space between them slowly growing as Valletta floated down to the ground, or at least that was how it appeared to viewers. Cornelia shrieked and burst into tears, watching Valletta's rueful smile and soft gaze disappear over the side of the ledge as if watching her own little sister. Even the cannon that followed sounded oddly muffled, paying its respects to the spunky little girl from 6. The parakeets almost instantly dissipated as soon as Valletta's body hit the ground, allowing a dizzy Cornelia to slowly pick herself back up and drag herself over to the wall to assess what she still had left. Carrie kept vigilant watch from the groundskeeping building, eyes narrowed with calm precision as he scanned the area for Mutz and his final opponent. The cameras delicately panned between the serene and calculating boy with his gardening spade and throwing knives, as well as the sunburnt and fatigued girl clutching a dagger and slumped over on the floor of the fort. Their gazes met for a brief second, the boy's dark eyes peering out from a window, and the girl's greenish-blue eyes staring wearily down at the courtyard below. Both pairs of eyes flew open in surprise as Carrie hardly wasted a moment and flew out the front of the groundskeeping building, sprinting into the fort and up the stairs before Cornelia could even register that she had seen him. Carrie charged down the hall to the limp girl and drew one of his last 2 throwing knives, stabbing her in the stomach with the same calm and composure as when he euthanized animals back in District 10. Cornelia gasped in pain and placed a hand to her blood-soaked stomach, staring up at Carrie with a fear that slowly twisted into fury. Painstakingly, she struggled to her feet and lunged forward with her dagger, managing to take him by surprise and deeply gash his collarbone area. The two engaged in a ferocious fight, their motions blurring together as commentators remarked that it was difficult to tell who was who, despite the size and physical differences of the pair. Cornelia had her strength and precision from mining, but Carrie had practical experience with killing animals, creating a somewhat evenly matched fight with many smaller injuries inflicted on both combatants. At one point, Carrie succeeded in picking Cornelia up and attempting to throw her back down against the stone floor hard enough to knock her out. However, she twisted just in time, and her arm took the fall instead of her head, resulting in a loud pop that Dr. Bacchus Crisp declared on Rosalia's show to mean her shoulder had been dislocated. Cornelia screamed in agony as Carrie bore down on her and raised his knives to stab her, kicking him in the groin by accident and allowing her to somewhat recover, though she was still holding in her innards after being stabbed in the stomach and appeared quite pale. Carrie stumbled back from the kick to his groin, but gritted his teeth and stabbed Cornelia again in the side amid her screams. He seized her by the shirt and once again tried to throw her down, this time landing on her already dislocated arm and fracturing it. At this point, Cornelia nearly passed out of consciousness and lay on the ground, pale as a sheet. Carrie cracked his neck and went in for the kill, stabbing down into the ground, until he realized that his knife was now lodged in the stone floor. Cornelia, barely holding on, had just rolled out of the way in time. The boy scowled in irritation and tried again, but she limply grabbed onto his wrist. Yet at this moment, the fight was interrupted by a flock of agitated parakeets, which quickly assailed the pair due to the large amount of red blood dripping from both of them. Cornelia hastily curled into a ball with her head between her knees to avoid their deadly claws, while Carrie swiped at them and tried to get them out of his face. To Carrie's surprise and Cornelia's relief, the birds began to ignore Cornelia and viciously attacked Carrie, as Cornelia had now concealed both her red hair and the blood on her stomach, but the gash across the boy's collarbone was prominent. Eyes wide in fear, he inched further and further back toward the courtyard to escape them, until he felt nothing but air beneath him, coupled with Cornelia's sad smile from above. Cornelia then collapsed into unconsciousness on the stone floor, not even looking as the boy in front of her plummeted to the ground in the same way as little Valletta had gone, and his cannon rang out, a plume of parakeets descending on his falling body. Not even head game makers Lock and Lock announcing that Cornelia Creed of District 1 was the victor of the 109th Hunger Games could revive her, as she was immediately airlifted from the arena to Mace Hospital. From recently recovered medical records, we know that the capital's top physicians quickly performed emergency surgery to replenish the blood she lost in the final fight and reduce her near-fatal stab wounds to minor injuries in order to render her more presentable. While Cornelia's shoulder was quickly popped back into place and her sunburn cleared up on its own, doctors informed the public that her arm would take several weeks to heal, and thus Cornelia arrived at her victor's interview with a plaster cast around her arm. Rosalia greeted her cheerfully, dressed in a colorful dress made to resemble the feathers of the parakeets in this year's arena, and offered her a seat. The young victor wore a stunning golden gown sprinkled with gold dust to her interview, which Rosalia noted was a surprising change from her red dresses in the pre-game segments. Cornelia replied that just as she had grown out of that shade of red, she had grown from her time in the arena, sparking applause from the audience. The pair discussed the games, and particularly Cornelia's reactions to having seen the conspiracy against the careers unfold in front of her during the bloodbath. She admitted to Rosalia that she believed it was in fact her youth and size that had saved her from being massacred, along with the other careers, and led the outliers to possibly mistake her for Zélie, clarifying that she believed they had either forgotten she was a career or determined her to be less of a threat than her allies. She was quite well received by the Capitol audience as they cheered Red Reckoning in support of her upon her exit from the stage, her new victor's nickname. Rosalia then welcomed head game makers Lock and Lock as usual, crisply dressed in clean khaki suits. The head game makers admitted that this games had been one of the most unexpected in a while, considering the shocking results of the bloodbath and the chaos caused by the agitated parakeets, resulting in a final fight that did not even end in the tributes killing each other. The head game makers were even more reluctant than usual to reveal the arena for the following year, as it was a quell, but assured an antsy Rosalia that they were sure it would be sufficiently harrowing to go along with next year's quell twist. Cornelia returned home to District 1 and was welcomed with open arms by her district. Not only had a younger victor like herself given hope to many more in the district, but her rags to riches tale had become almost an urban legend. It was as a result of her victory that District 1 would have to revert to its previous system of holding a talent contest to determine its tributes for each year, as many youths in the district believed that if Cornelia Creed could do it, they could too. Cornelia served as the female mentor for District 1 for future tributes, alongside her former mentor, Alexander Nicoline. The two were well known to have a sibling-like relationship, with Cornelia providing support and assistance to Alexander throughout his many troubles in life. She also became a popular spokeswoman for a high-end Capitol skincare brand, and appeared in many of its sunscreen advertisements, both on Capitol TV and in magazines. A decade after her victory, Cornelia met and married her future husband, an instructor at one of District 1's training academies, while meeting with its faculty to discuss her funding a series of training scholarships for low-income citizens of the district. They went on to have 3 children and continue to live happily in their home district, even being profiled and interviewed for a Capitol Family Lifestyle magazine after the birth of their 3rd child. Cornelia was also known as a fixture at Capitol parties, though her exploits were not nearly as wild as those of certain other victors, and she reportedly spent most of her time bribing servers to not provide Alexander with any alcohol at these events. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Panem Reborn, File 109, and I hope you'll continue watching the next 2 episodes that I put out in the coming weeks, and hopefully in the future once I return from my hiatus. Please join the Panem Reborn Discord server, as I will say every single time. I promise Cornelia Creed is not going to slash a dagger at me, and she's not going to throw her hair at me either. So I hope you guys have a good day, afternoon, morning, evening, night, whatever that might be. And remember, Panem today, Panem tomorrow, Panem forever.